Welcome back to the Lift Free and Diet Hard podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Coates. Join me along with industry leaders and friends on a quest to get more people through the gym door and eating and living healthier. Join me where evidence meets empathy while rejecting fitness industry fads and extremism. Let's begin. Long overdue. Ben Giannis, you and I have been following each other for quite a long time. Well, you have an excuse. You've been really busy. You've grown a massive following. You are one of my favorite and rare nuance communicators and educators when it comes to anything related to biomechanics. The famous skeleton's in the corner. You've got the modern meathead as one of your brand pillars, Bachelor of Health Sciences. Your cat Chester, who is currently recovering from a battle with intestinal cancer, if I understand correctly, is like floating in the background there. But it's great to have you on.
Dude, thank you so much for the intro, for having me. And I also just want to say before we get started, like just a word of like gratitude for you and like what you do in this space. And also, as you'll remember, years ago, maybe 6 years ago at this point, like when we first started to sort of cross paths online, like you were one of the kind of people who really started to push my stuff to your audience. And as you know well, like the butterfly effect of these things is really, really important. And also, people get lucky in the ways that I did. So I just want to express that gratitude toward you, not only just for this chat, but also just, everything from here prior.
Well, I look at what you do. There's a number of people that do this very well, short form, video-based social media, communicating these concepts. I mean, it's really just kind of the next generation of what I came up on and got involved in, which is the longer form articles with video embedded for publications like T Nation, right? And
Yeah.
so obviously the way that people consume media has changed, and I'm still a big believer in long form articles. There's a lot less that T Nation doesn't function the same way it used to. And I think that done well, social media does overlap it. There's a lot of people who say it's not the same thing. I will not throw the baby out with the bath water on that stuff.
Yeah.
Skilled, evidence-based communicators can do well on social media. And quite frankly, I'm glad you embraced it. I just don't have the stamina to do the video-based stuff you do. Uh, I pulled a bunch of stuff from your media because it's good. So here's the first quote. This is going to piss a lot of coaches off, but the vast majority of the assessments you're doing are a total waste of everyone's time. All right, explain that one. By the way, I agree. I love this one.
Yeah. So I'll start big picture. I think a lot of coaches have really, really good intentions, like especially the coaches who are in this space, who might be listening to this chat, who seek out information online, who want to like better themselves for their own sake and for their clients' sakes. Like, and so I really, really appreciate people who just have an interest to begin with. And a lot of times that leads them toward things like learning about assessments, learning from this system, learning from that system. So I think this all begins with good intention. But I think what it often very quickly turns into is this kind of way for the coach, the trainer, the even the physical therapist to, in some subtle or big way, like separate themselves from a client. Like the coach, essentially becomes this figure who is like starting to perform surgery as if like the coach is, the arbiter of exactly what, they know what will happen. They know whether this range of motion will lead to this outcome, or whether this is limited, or whether that's excessive. It's like this really, really overpowering sense of like black and white knowing tends to
Mm,
come out of the assessment process. And a lot of trainers, I think, do it. Number one, I get again because they're just interested, but also because like it does present this sort of like veneer of expertise. Like, I am the trainer who has this plan, who is going to know exactly what needs to be done. And it's just like if you've, trained anyone for any length of time, as I know you have, Andrew, it's like none of these things that people present are predictable. I've seen people who have like literally 0 degrees of rotation from, particular shoulder positions, who have literally never had a shoulder pain complaint in their life with me. And I know people who are on the total opposite side of the spectrum who fit, the textbook perfect definition of like what mobile is, who are just constantly dealing with issues. So I generally think it's a waste of time, not because there's no value, because there are ways in which I could probably pluck certain things out of it. Like if you have a refined process that just makes someone feel comfortable, right? There's validity to that. Maybe you're not even really doing it because of the fact that you think it's going to provide you with clear answers, but more so because you're creating this initial space with the client to maybe get to know them a little bit better, to have some emotional connection. So I can make arguments in favor of it as well. But I think what I see most often is people essentially using it as a way to kind of put themselves in this position of knowing. And I think the last thing I'll say on it too is like it typically prevents trainers from seeing that the process of assessment is not this like constrained thing that begins on the first 15 minutes of the first session, right? Like, no, dude, like assessment is training. Like training is assessment, coaching is assessment. That like there is no point at which your client is doing anything that is not in some way an assessment. So in this, I think, bigger way, it does sort of like, I don't know, set a little bit of a misleading expectation for a framework that I think is most helpful for a coach, because that's what ultimately I'm after here is what is most helpful to coaches. I'm not actually that interested, at least at this point in time, in just being right about everything. Although that's fun too. I'm just interested in like how can coaches go about their sessions with this assessment process always in the back of their mind, and what that looks like is just starting exercise, starting normal stuff as quickly as possible, at least for me.
Always assessing all the time. A few quick thoughts. One, I think that formal assessments, they can create gaps between the excitement and the readiness for the person to start and what we would call actual training. I can have someone do a body weight squat in their first session as a warm up to loading them a little bit more. I can assess as they're squatting to look for any sort of funky stuff. But here's the other thing too. There's a motor skill development thing that probably is more to do with the issues of their movement than any physical movement limitations.
Mhm.
And sometimes it's giving them a goblet in their hands so that automatically organizes their bodies without almost any cueing. So how valuable was the assessment of the body weight squat in the first place? I think to your point, I think a lot of coaches are looking for a reliable, perfectly predictable framework of here's how someone moves. Here is potential injury concerns. We know through research like that old functional movement screen, there's no injury predictive validity to that. And I think a lot of coaches are looking for a standardized playbook of here's what presents, here's the specific exercise to prescribe, and here is a guaranteed outcome. That isn't training. And the smartest physical therapists, because you alluded to them, that I've had on the podcast, they're often less concerned with an exact physical diagnosis of an injury and more, okay, let's figure out what you are capable of doing. And I find a lot of this stuff is highly individual. So love that. Okay, next next one. How do science-based lifters and anti-science-based lifters rely on each other to make content? Oh, he's smiling. Good.
Yeah, well, so I love this one because you see this in all sorts of areas, right? So this is everything from science-based lifters to anti-science-based lifters. This is Batman to Joker. This is, which I think maybe even you commented.
That is the reference, and I've got an episode coming up where this will be relevant when it comes to nutrition. Absolutely. That is the thing. Batman
Yeah,
needs Joker. Joker needs
yeah,
Batman.
that's
Yep.
right. And Batman is kind of like the anti-science-based lifter to me in many contexts because Batman is like in denial a little bit, and the Joker is the one who's like, Batman, you don't realize this, brother, but like you need you need me to like feel the way you do. Um, and uh, I'm very hesitant to even veer even slightly in the direction of politics, but like politics, it's everywhere, right? So, but as this appears in like science-based lifting versus anti-science, you see like microcosms of this in different like areas of the industry and the PT industry and in the personal training industry and the strength training industry. You see it everywhere where and social media really I think feeds into this more than anything. You see this situation where one person who has one opinion almost is giving that opinion almost exclusively because of the fact that it is in reference to something that someone said on the other side of the aisle. And so there's this constant like back and forth firing where people aren't really actually interested in talking to each other or are talking to each other or are attempting to start conversations. What both people are doing is they're responding to people on the other side of the aisle each within their own kind of like echo chambers. So the science-based people are speaking to the science-based people, the anti-science are speaking to the anti-science very, very often. Obviously, there's some degree of overlap. But what this does is it gives people the illusion of like some kind of culture battle that people can identify with and commit themselves to and spend lots of time talking about. And I've certainly fallen into and out of this pattern, which I think is the only way in which I've been able to actually recognize like, oh shit, I have been like living this life for some time. And the reason that I think it's so kind of captivating is because you are so strongly you become so strongly identified with a side that it's almost like all you see in your feed are things that relate to either your side or the opposite of it. So the echo chamber effect is real because you dig deep, and when you stay in that kind of like land, what I realized for me is like everything around you will stagnate, right? So the kinds of people you meet and talk to will stagnate because you're essentially just speaking to people who either already agree with you or who are just going to yell at you. Your ability to learn will stagnate because your identification with particular groups, your identification with particular beliefs will essentially tie you to staying within that fight because it's exciting and there's like transient reward from it. So everything like in terms of what actually moves people forward, I've noticed specifically like all the coaches that I work with, they get stuck when they stay in this fight, right? Essentially. And when people stay in these fights, yeah, I just the goal is so clearly to me not to actually understand. And what I have realized about this whole thing, speaking to the post that you're referencing, is like the people who think they are the most opposed, the anti-science, the science, are actually the most alike, right? Because each person is essentially screaming into their own cave, and each person isn't hearing the other, and each person definitely thinks that they are right, that the other camp is wrong. And what I've noticed in terms of creators who get stuck in these worlds is their content just essentially hasn't changed throughout the course of, their opinions haven't changed throughout the course of the last 4, 5, 6 years. And I think that much like with that, training in general, strength training, hypertrophy training, right, what defines evolution is very often just the ability to roll with the changing landscape of like your internal system and how your system is responding differently to training. So I think it's true with social media growth too, where people get stuck because they're caught in these particular battles. And what actually allows them to progress in the domains of like knowledge and understanding is just allowing those changes to sort of happen and to actually start to see differences in opinion, which is difficult because then your audience that has supported all of your opinions to this point, right? They start to push back on you, and so you ultimately, in my opinion, want to develop an audience that can actually think for themselves. And what I realized a couple years ago is like, oh, I'm starting to get a lot of comments that are like very culty. Like, what is it that I am doing that is really pulling this out of people? So it's mainly just for me, it's been a consequence of like wanting to continue to evolve. And a lot of times that for me has just meant like letting go of beliefs that have really, really stuck me in battles for long periods of times.
And I've noticed that you've been willing to move with, evidence, basically. There's a few things I notice. One, I feel like both these science and anti-science camps, as we define them, and that's tricky in itself, they tend to strawman the other side's arguments. And I also find that each title is almost defined by the other. It's almost like the outgroup is boxing in with a label, this
Yeah,
particular in-group.
totally.
And then to what you just said, and this is a concept I've heard Chris Williamson say on Modern Wisdom a bunch of times, and it comes with any tribal identity, is if you do not exist solely within the tribal ideology and spout all of the, like, outsource your opinions and belief systems, download everything from the tribe so that way you can't critically think for yourself, which I think is manifested here, manifests in politics, manifests in nutrition, you
Yeah.
name it, the high volume, low volume thing, which I'll reference in a second. You become an unreliable ally if you question the dogma of it or you express any opinion that does not line up with the absolute uh, like dogma of the tribal ideology. And that's a difficult place to be, especially if you built an identity as a, and then there's the other side of it, is gaining status within the tribal ideology itself, which we see a lot of.
Yeah.
And then the low versus high volume reference I was going to make is I think these are they're not as far apart as people sort of present them to be. And I probably bias more towards high volume ideology as a foundation bit, the people who influence me. But I've gone and had the conversation with the Dr. Eric Helms and the Dr. Pack and figured out, okay, what is the evidence actually saying? Let's get rid of the dogmatism and the absolute statements that we sometimes see from some of the, I call them the hypertrophy bro crowd of the industry. Right? And if they're saying something dogmatic and absolute, and you get people with, respected people like Eric Helm speaking, with nuance, who am I paying attention to? But I've realized that, there's a lot that makes sense. And I've had those episodes. And one of the big things is, there is fairly significant diminishing returns. So both low volume training can be very effective, but it's not optimal. Oversimplification, but that's one of the conclusions. You're smiling as I said all that. So I'll bounce it back to you.
Well, I just find it relatable in terms of both the fact that I have been there, done that, subscribed to a camp, bounced to the other camp, and then realized that like, both have their validity. And I think I'm laughing because I don't know, the more I've learned and like the more nuanced my opinions have become, like most of my responses to questions now it just always starts with like questions for the person I'm responding to. If that makes sense. And so it's rare now that I have the desire even to give people straight answers, which people find incredibly annoying, and which is also like antithetical to the way that content, at least historically, tends to work, which is like you have a strong opinion, you express your strong opinion, and then people, bite down on it or clap for you in response. And what I found is the more nuanced, the more developed, just as my brain has become in these regards, the more that other people tend to interpret what I'm saying about anything as the same as saying nothing. So if, for instance, we say, okay, what's better, like high volume or low volume? If I'm talking to a person in front of me, I'm just going to start to ask them questions about what they're doing, what they've done in the past, what they think has worked for them, how their body responds. Have they even paid attention to any of that to begin with? I have 100 questions for this person. But when we're talking through, to some degree podcast format, but way more so with like, Instagram posts or stories or those sorts of things, you just don't have the room, the kind of room for the uncertainty. You don't have the room for the nuance. You don't have the room for context creation. So what we're left with is like this space where people are just looking for strong opinions. And the less that I have fed into the strong opinion thing, the more that people just think that I have no idea what I'm talking about, which is totally fine to some degree anyway, right? Because I do, as I said earlier, I want to filter for the people who are going to actually be interested in being left with a question, for instance. So I've run an experiment recently, Andrew, in some of my content where I will actually finish the post with a question. And the purpose of that is to basically filter for the people who are going to leave that post with that question and be like, huh, like I wonder what I think about that, right? Like I want to be talking to the people who create their own sense of agency around these things, which is definitely not where I used to be with content in general. So I do think that it is a tough thing to engage with social media when a vast majority of the people on the platforms expect particular things, especially because I've been different ways in the past. And I just think this process for me has been largely like, honestly, like one of the most like growth promoting things for me in general in my life, because so much of the drama that comes from like having this job has functioned as like really, really potent psychological, emotional fuel to like, I don't know, understand myself better, I guess.
That's wise. And I've seen this process over the years. I think to something you said, and this is again a paraphrase from somebody else, I think people aren't always interested in your opinion about something. They just want to hear their opinion come out of your mouth, whether they decide
Mm.
you are, an approved person or, a bad guy, right? And then,
Yeah.
even within a lot of the training realms, there is a self-segmentation that becomes quite polarizing. I suppose This conversation starts with this science versus anti-science thing. Are there any defining characteristics of these camps you find reliable enough to be able to say, all right, this is who they are?
Mm. Yeah, so I think both to my last point on the earlier splurge I had, both camps, you can identify a camp by just the degree of like certainty in the claims. So the science-based people will say, just as the first example that comes to my mind, like, don't raise your arms above your head in a pull down, like your lats will basically turn off, in the top portion of the range of motion. The anti-science camp will say something like, you don't need any fancy exercises, just bench press, right? So like in either case, you could, if you dug deep, 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 and you really were trying to, as an intellectual exercise, understand where truth is in either one of those things, you could pluck out some truth, right? Bench press, great exercise, nothing wrong with it inherently. Um, you know, the whole lat thing above 120 degrees, right? There's part of that with the lats mechanics makes sense. Ultimately, it doesn't make sense, right? But so the starting point for me is how strong is the claim, how black and white, and how much sort of like if, ands, or buts are given with the claim. To determine from there, like, okay, which which camp tends to be, yeah, which camp tends to be which based on what people are saying. The science-based camp is really not a science-based camp, which I'll get to. The
Oh, actually,
science-based,
I'll throw something in there. I actually think
yeah,
there are three camps. It's just that the third camp is the classic evidence-based, understand and interpret the research, but apply it in the real world environment. And I use the example of a Dr. Eric Helms
mm,
as a great person that I would consider to be in the evidence-based side of stuff, but they're not dogmatic.
right, yeah, totally, yeah. So science-based in this context that we're talking about, it might be science-based with
Mm.
quotations, totally. So the science-based with quotations people will typically cite some kind of study and create some kind of gross extrapolation from the study. So if a study says, you know, um, this muscle has a moment arm of this length in this position, someone might say, okay, well, that's the position that we need to train that muscle in forever and always, and anywhere, any exercise that doesn't target that position, waste of time. So the way that the science-based people lose their nuance is by essentially using study references as a shield um, to essentially cover up all of the things in the background that don't make any sense whatsoever, right? That context would provide. So the shield for the science-based people is the PubMed, typically a screenshot or a series of screenshots with some highlights in there. Um, and then the shield for the anti-science people is, well, on average, in my experience, tends to be like more of the personal attacks kind of thing. Right? So they're less concentrated on information. They're more concentrated on vibes, which honestly, Andrew, vibes work. Vibes are strong, right? So when someone, for instance, is responding to a science-based thing as an anti-science-based person, they're typically feeding off of the vibes of like anger, like a kind of like bullying type of energy, like all these weak little kids type of commentaries. And the people who also feel that way will be like, yeah, hell yeah, like weak kids, like, screw these kids. So one tends to be more like emotionally driven. The other tends to be more of like this way for people to feign like intellect. And I think in both cases, both people are using a sort of frontline shield that makes people miss everything important in the background.
A quick pause for a sponsor shout out. I've been working with Train Heroic for several rounds of my online programs, and I'm working on expanding what I offer through the platform. Train Heroic is easy to use, and my clients love it. And I have friends who've sunk tens of thousands of dollars in their own app while constantly worrying and hoping that it doesn't break. Using Train Heroic means no stress for me. I trust Train Heroic's long-standing reputation for quality as an industry leader, and I know their team personally, and they're quick to come to my aid when I break things. I sometimes break things. Trade Heroic is also trusted by some of the industry's best coaches, including people like Joe DeFranco, Jason Brown, Vernon Griffith, Dr. Megan Sack-Akbina, Mike Boyle, and Angus Bradley. And we've updated your free trial with more support from the Trade Heroic team and to set you up and help maximize the platform's potential. You start with a 30-day free trial, and once you sign up, I'll cover your second month. You get 60 days free total. Start your trial at www.trainheroic.com, and when the Trade Heroic team reaches out, tell them you came from me and the Lift Free and Diet Art podcast, and they'll hook you up. At the risk of sounding like I drift more towards the anti-science camp, the characteristics I've noticed, at least on the surface, are the science-based crowd tend to bias younger. They tend to be less jacked. But the flip side is the anti-science crowd, I think on average, there's a lot of steroid enhancement and good genetics in the mix there too. And some
Totally.
of that stuff is downloaded from like, old school bro bodybuilder based stuff. I think that's it. I think the anti-science crowd aren't as they're oftentimes are fairly evidence-based. It's just that kind of the classic brute force, train hard, eat, mix in the other factors I just mentioned, which tends to yield good results in the bodybuilding side of the realm. Um, but of course, the straw man argument is that the science-based lifters are all these skinny kids in the gym. And unfortunately, I am seeing a bit of this in the gym that I train at. I have to be careful with what I say, but it's the single arm tricep press down with a cuff, a little bit of that seatbelt action for stability. That's not the constraint in the first place. That's limiting them. With a 5 rep max to hard failure with it's just like, and I want to, I leave them alone. I don't go anywhere near it, but I want to say to these guys, like, this ain't it. This just isn't it.
Yeah. So really good point about the general observation in terms of like who tends to say what. I think that selection bias is real, where I think, kids who are maybe 14, 15, 16, who are like really just naturally small, skinny guys, like I think they get into the intellect because of the fact that they're not they're not benching 225 in high school type of kid, right? So, um, and I can really empathize with that. Like I was never exactly like a super small, super skinny kid. But I was not one of these people who just grew looking at weights. And so that was kind of like my initial motivation for actually starting to learn stuff. I think I think that the one thing I would say about the anti-science sort of steroid using jacked bro archetype is people who have lots of like experience in any domain very often, and by people I mean I've observed this in myself. What I tend to do is I tend to like look back with a very specific lens that I would like to believe. And I look back and I say, oh, that whole time, like I could have just been doing these basic exercises, right? But the reality was just like that just was never where I was at. Like I was benching for years and just like repeatedly hurting my shoulders. And now I can because I know, because I'm a much more skilled lifter, I know how to do a bench press in a way that doesn't hurt my shoulder. I know how to program in a way that makes my training sustainable. I know how to adjust my program if something isn't going well. So I can now bench press without that sort of negative experience. But my tendency is to look back and think something like, oh, I could have just been doing this all along. The reality is, no, like I just did not have the skill, I did not have the knowledge at the times that I was really struggling to figure those things out. So I needed, by definition, at the time, I just needed different solutions. So I think this like anti-science bro opinion tends to, I think, miss what like the actual experience was maybe like for them. I think people often come out the other end of something successful and kind of tend to like rewrite the story that they've actually lived. And in a lot of cases, the story is non-linear. I mean, in all cases, it's non-linear. It tends to be very messy. It tends to be like, oh, this worked for some time and then it didn't, and then I did this other thing. And so I just think that any advanced lifter who looks back should really, really do their best to put themselves in the shoes of like the version of themselves that was really struggling. Because when people are really struggling to figure things out, like basically just bullying them is not is not the way it's not the way to go about, actually helping them. So I take a much more like, hey, I want to understand this person type of approach, which very often too is triggering to these people as well.
I feel like this overlaps, but I always think it's slightly different. I think in the experienced and let's call them the fairly jacked lifters that tend to be defined as more the anti-science crowd. I find that the over-index on some of the minor stuff like exercise selection as being the differentiating factor as to why muscles
Mm.
grow. And you'll hear people say that, oh, in order to hit this particular part of your tricep, you have to do a reverse grip press down, which has no bearing and just has a weaker grip position than a overhanded press down, for example. Right? It's like, tell me you don't understand human anatomy and biomechanics when you say shit like that. But I find that's fairly typical of them. And then they under index on the power of things like genetics and steroids and just the overall
Mm.
consistency. So I think that they kind of over attribute specific exercise selection. And this actually kind of goes to a quote: exercises don't have a purpose, only people have a purpose. So what does that mean?
Ooh. Yeah, my first thought was like, damn, that's a fire quote. And then I realized,
It's your
wait,
quote.
no, it's my quote. Yeah, of course I would think that. Um, yeah, so I mean, it speaks to the idea that just generally, like, exercises to me are like foods, right? Like, you have foods that are, um, fill certain nutritional buckets and don't fill other nutritional buckets, right? I'm not gonna go and eat eggs if I want carbohydrates, right? As an example. And I think that, we as people who select exercises very often have success with an exercise and assume that there's something mystical or magical about an exercise, much like success with food, like, oh, I tried this diet and this happened. And
The
it's like, okay,
tilapia thinning skin thing with the classic
right,
bodybuilders.
right. It's everywhere. Yeah, so obviously because it's a human pattern, you see it mirrored, across all these domains. But the point is basically just that like exercises are not number one, they're not single things, right? Like a squat, how you define a squat, you could define a squat in 10 different ways. If I have 10 different clients in front of me and I tell them to squat, I might get 10 totally different looking things and 10 slightly different outcomes. So to me, it's really just about asking as a priority question, what is the goal of the person rather than what exercise should I do, right? The exercise that you select always relates to the goal of the person. And if you don't know the goal of the person or the goal of the client plus coach together, then you're in some ways throwing shit at the fan and hoping to see sort of what sticks. So every exercise, whether you know it or not, has a purpose. It has something it is accomplishing. And the key thing to me, across people who I see are successful in lifting and coaching is they always know why they're doing what they're doing. What is this for? Where is this fitting into my program? How does it relate to the other surrounding exercises? Right? You see bodybuilders, for example, who are doing essentially the same exercise 10 different ways, right? It's like a pec fly and then a machine fly and then a dumbbell fly and then an incline fly and it's like, okay, yeah, there's utility to redundancy, and I'm not suggesting that like you know high level bodybuilders don't know what they're doing by any means, but I do find that like very often people prioritize the exercise name, like the vibe of what the exercise means to them over what the goal actually is. So it's just this general notion that the first question should always be, what am I trying to do? Rather than what exercise should I do?
That makes a lot of sense. I think I'll add some context to it. And this is a conversation I had recently with Jason Brown, and he starts with understanding, okay, what are the exercise equipment that someone has, and related to that is what are their like joint injury limitations. So to your point about a squat, does someone have a well-equipped gym but the pendulum squat just treats them better? I'm a good example of that. Pendulum squat just feels better than a barbell squat does at this point in my life and with my joints. Do I have someone where uh, any sort of squat motion just doesn't seem to agree with them, or we have challenges loading them effectively? Like goblet squat, great, but it doesn't overload them enough. Whereas you've got a lunge or reverse lunge, something like that. They've got the space, they've got the implements. What are we looking for? We're looking to train the quads. We're looking to train knee flexion exercise. And as long as we put tension on muscle, I recently said this on social media, uh, muscles don't know exercises, they know tension, right?
Yeah.
And tension's a stimulus to get someone to grow. And oftentimes what someone likes and whether or not something causes someone pain are usually the reasons why I choose an exercise, not because I believe a specific exercise is the optimal expression of that particular thing.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is where the physics stuff really comes in handy, which is like really experienced lifters who never, for instance, like open a physics textbook or anything. They just learn the physics like somatically. They just feel it. Like, oh, when I put my feet here, this feels like more my quads. When I put my feet here, this feels more glutes. This feels more adductors. But people who are new to lifting, and who are new to learning and who don't have that experience, don't have that kind of attunement to their system. And so to me, like a lot of like the teaching process, especially with coaches who are not super deep into their education, careers, is like just teaching people like the basic physics of like, hey, this is how our muscles are actually loaded, right? To your point, like muscles no tension, and the external version of that is like muscles no force and muscles no torque. And so the way that you orient your body relative to a force is what determines how your muscles respond. So starting people from that physics-based place is really a good supplement. And I say supplement because you need, as we're saying, like as we were talking about earlier, you need the actual experience, you need the actual feeling of what do these changes actually transmit to in my experience. Because if you just have the textbook understanding of things, to our science-based lifter conversation, and you go and do that textbook thing, um, you can very easily convince yourself that like you're having experiences that you actually aren't, because that's what you're kind of looking for. So it's really just about marrying both of those two things as important and true. And then just letting your experience guide the important questions for you.
To my coach listeners, I have a little something of value for you, a $1,500 value seminar for just $19, but let me explain the context first. Endorsing people I know and trust is everything. My friend, Dr. Sean Pastuch, is the founder of Active Life. Sean and I have presented at fitness conferences together, and we share a philosophy on helping coaches serve their clients better and want caring professionals to stay in a fulfilling career they love. Sean and Active Life have something of value for you. If you're a fitness coach who works with clients who have pain and movement limitations, and isn't that almost every client, and you feel like you're guessing at solutions instead of following a system, Active Life's professional biomechanics assessment workshop will be of value to you. It's a 2-day live online workshop where you'll learn the foundational principles behind assessment, load management, and how to actually help clients move and feel better. This used to be a $1,500 seminar that people would fly in to attend. Right now, it's just $19. And for listeners of the show, the CEU upgrade worth $100 is completely free. Just use the code COATS at checkout. Go to the link in the description to grab your spot. Again, use the code COATS at checkout. All right, another quote. And this one, so context. You use a preacher curl as an illustration of this. So I'm hoping everybody listening understands what we mean by a preacher curl. There's a bench in front of you, your arm is pinned, it's extended out forward more.
Yeah.
It's not the exercise that's dangerous. It's how people approach, in this context, preacher curls. In the context of people going from never loading this position to suddenly loading it heavy. Do you want to explain what that's about?
Yeah, so this connects to our exercises tools conversation as well, because I think people tend to view exercises as good, bad, healthy, unhealthy, good for joints, bad for joints, good for posture, bad for posture, those sorts of things. And when you view exercises that way, it's convenient because it gives you a sense of knowing, right? Like our first conversation about assessment. It gives you a sense of like, oh yes, I have a very clear understanding of what this thing does. A squat is a squat. This is how it looks. A deadlift is a deadlift. This is how it looks. But what it prevents is it prevents you from actually really understanding the way that you're thinking about things and really actually improving your ability to like navigate problems independently. So what I mean is, if you see a video on the internet of someone doing a preacher curl tearing their biceps, and your conclusion is preacher curls are bad, that is basically the same as you, for instance, eating a piece of tilapia and maybe you have some slight indigestion, and then you saying, oh, all tilapia forever is bad. No one should have tilapia, right? When the reality is, well, maybe you just had 20 ounces, and maybe that was a lot of tilapia. Maybe next time, instead of 20, you try 10 or you try 5, right? So in the same way, when people hurt themselves doing preacher curls, right, it's essentially a way for people to prevent themselves from taking responsibility for the poor approach that they had,
Mhm.
because it's very easy to point the finger at the preacher curl and say, "Oh, it's the preacher curl's fault that I got hurt." And when you say it's the preacher curl's fault, what you prevent yourself from seeing is, "Oh, I was just using way too much load, way more than I could have handled," or, "Oh, I really wasn't controlling the tempo at all in the bottom half of this rep," right? So when people blame exercises, this is also true of life, right? When you blame other people in life for your problems, it's very disempowering to yourself, right? Like, oh, this other person is in control of what happens to me. That's essentially what that's saying. So it's like when you take this perspective of, oh, the preacher curl is bad, you totally disempower yourself and the agency that you could develop um, in your understanding to get to a point where, oh, no, I can do preacher curls. I just have to use an appropriate tempo because I'm not used to this position, maybe even slower than usual. Maybe I'll even pause in the bottom, and maybe I'll err on the side of using a lighter load because I've really never done this before. So overall, the exercise blame is like the really key concept there for me, because people who blame exercises tend not to learn anything, much like people who blame other people in life all the time tend not to learn anything.
There is there's something in this, and I hadn't thought about preach curls in this lens before, but I think there's a good categorization. There's the exercise selection, and then there's the population that self-selects to those exercises, who almost universally does preacher curls, right? Younger guys, guys
Yeah.
who ego lift, etc. And I think it's the same phenomenon as when, and I've had lots of discussions on this podcast about, the injury risk of, big barbell lifts. And there's some people that won't touch them, and there's other people that defend them. And it's almost like this same dichotomous camp,
Yeah,
straw
yeah.
man arguments on each side. I think they mostly agree on most principles. But who tend to get themselves into trouble when it comes to barbell deadlifts, barbell squatting, especially, right? Barbell bench pressing. It's kind of that ego lifting young guy. And it's not to say that's inherently bad. Pushing your limits, great, but I think that there are certain exercises. I don't think they're universally bad by any means. I think it's wise to treat them with maybe a little bit more respect, and therefore approach them with a little bit more caution. And all this is really just smart load management. And I think the core of this is the guy who goes in and starts doing preacher curls, and he's used to doing dumbbell curls. When you throw around some pretty decent weight on a dumbbell curl or a barbell curl, they fail to realize it's actually a different position. It's a longer moment arm. And if you go and grab the same weight that you did with a dumbbell curl, there's significantly more force on, let's say, your bicep tendon. And then the other part of this too is when this goes badly, unfortunately, with this particular exercise, it usually goes quite badly where you get a bicep tendon rupture. So again, exercise not inherently bad. I just think go in and respect this. I think you should respect everything, but there's certain exercises where it's probably wise that, hey, let's take a little bit extra on the side of caution here, build up a tolerance to it, respect it.
Yeah, totally. And two things that come up for me there is one is like ultimately it is about someone's prior exposure to that loading in that position, number one. And number two, the kind of inherent nature of like how fuck upable an exercise is. Like you can totally screw up, I don't know, like a pull down, for example, and it's like, okay, what's going to happen? Like you're gonna fail to pull down, like you're secured in a seat. There's literally no way that the weight can fall on you. There's just like so many built-in safety nets, or like a
Mm.
leg extension, right? Sit down and just start kicking. But like, yeah, to your point, you put a barbell on your back, you're dealing with a very different constraint. You put even a Smith machine, right, which is considered a lot safer. It's like I've literally seen, you see that video of that woman dying on a Smith machine, right? Like
Yep.
stuff like that happens. So not to, scare anyone, but yeah, there's totally more risk relative to the way that people tend to operate. But that doesn't necessarily make the way that you approach those things inherently different or look at those things inherently different.
And I think it's almost always a violation of good load management principles.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. Which a
All
good
right.
takeaway is like, hey, bro or sis, if this thing is new, just like just like really take it slow and really take it light and just do that for a long time and eventually you're going to be like shocked at how strong you get on that thing.
Anterior pelvic tilt is not something to fix.
Well, the best research we have on this, or I won't say best, I'll say, what word would I use? The research that we have on this, I mean, suggests that like somewhere in the range of 80 to 90% people have some form of anterior pelvic tilt, right? So it's kind of weird that like something that would be as a percentage like an actual normal uh, skeletal presentation is considered pathological. I mean, we could get into like where this comes from, the upper cross syndrome, the lower cross syndrome, research that was never validated. A lot of the posture asymmetry conversations fall into this trap. But yeah, just anything, any way in which you can, or any way in which any content creator is diagnosing you and your problems and why they're happening over the internet, I would scroll on, or I would unfollow, or I would maybe leave a comment like, makes no sense, LOL, or something like that. And the reason I would say that is not because anterior pelvic tilt, for example, could never be a problem. It's just that when people present pain symptoms, much like with the assessment process we were talking about, there is no need to try to get to the core of diagnosis. Right? I know you talked to Coach Q, and like
Mm.
he puts this kind of thing super well, which is like he doesn't he's not concerned with identifying root cause as much as he is at just addressing someone's experience and how their experience actually is. And I think that much like the blaming exercises thing, what happens with things like anterior pelvic tilt is people blame anterior pelvic tilt for their back pain, for example. And maybe, for instance, their back hurts because they're sitting for 12 hours a day and they're getting 2,000 steps, right? It's like it's very easy to jump over or step over these humongous rocks when we see off in the distance this flashy, sexy anterior pelvic tilt fix program that can, cure your back pain in, a couple of weeks. When the real difficulty of helping something like that is behavior change, is actually learning how to change what you pay attention to during your day. Are you even aware of the fact that your back starts to get tight when you're sitting for 4 hours straight? Like those types of things are the actual changes that allow people to develop like a sense of agency and power over changing their experience. The anterior pelvic tilt thing is basically like um, a way to convince yourself that you have answers that you just can't. So it's a very jarring thing for people to hear for the first time, that the thing that they thought was their problem for the last 5 years wasn't. It's like, bro, just experience the grief of that opinion, okay? We can like put it over there, we can leave it behind, and we can start to develop ourselves here forward.
How much of this do you think people just like to have a pathology that they can feel like there's an answer to a simple answer to their pain, their lack of getting whatever they've wanted, let's say in movement results.
Totally. And it's much like the science anti-science thing. It is actually strangely like a form of like self-identification, right? People don't just become attached to the idea of a quick fix. They become attached to the idea of a quick fix and also start to like identify themselves as someone who has this thing. Oh, yes, I have this thing. That I am a person who has this thing. And strangely, it's like even if someone claims verbally that they don't want to have that thing or they want to fix that thing, there is this kind of cycle of like anxiety that's almost somewhat interesting for people, where it's like, oh, I have a problem. Here I'm going to latch onto the problem to fix it. And I think people generally in life are just looking for the next most interesting problem. And I actually have thought a lot about this, and I've realized a lot of people actually like to think that there's something about themselves that needs to be fixed. That's like a very human, sort of inbuilt anxiety, I'll call it. So to get to a place where it's like, oh, I actually don't have a problem here, then it's like, well, what's the next step, right? It's not exactly clear, and that's destabilizing.
And how much of it is having a problem that absolves them of responsibility to
Totally.
do something to change the problem, make the problem go away.
Right. It's not my behavior, Andrew. It's the anterior pelvic tilt.
This episode is brought to you by Just Bite Me Meals. I work long days and I won't compromise my client experience or sacrifice my workout, sleep, or nutrition. So I needed a quality and reliable meal prep service so I could save time on cooking and shopping and have more time for the stuff that matters. Net out the cost of groceries and a service isn't as much as you might think, and regular impulsive food delivery apps, eating out, that costs way more anyway. I get more meal variety and less dishes to clean, and I've been referring clients to Just Bite Me meals for a long time, and I recently started ordering myself. Food is great. The beef brisket tacos are my favorite so far, and there's a lot of menu choice. Your calories and macros are listed. The portions are great. You can order custom meals. They deliver to your door, or you can pick up from their storefront. And I'm sorry to listeners outside of Alberta, but Just Bite Me Meals is currently just in Edmonton, Calgary, Grand Prairie, and Fort McMurray. Ordering from Just Bite Me Meals made my life easier instantly. And you can get 10% off on all your orders using my code, Andrew Coates Fitness, all caps, on their website. That's Andrew Coates Fitness, all capitals, or go to the link and the code in the show notes. You mentioned anxiety, and I mean, like, I'd be very careful, tread lightly here, but I mean, how much self-identification to mental health diagnosis do people have as an absolution from, the behaviors that might be blamed for it?
Yeah, really interesting you bring this up, and I will be careful. I'm not a mental health professional.
Nor
Disclaimer.
am I. Yep.
I saw this really, really interesting interview with this guy who's diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, which is different from the colloquial, oh,
Mm.
he's a narcissist, right? This is like a very defined thing in psychology, at least that I understand. And he was talking to this therapist for like 50 minutes and hours. Fascinating conversation for anyone who's like interested in this kind of thing. You could just look up like narcissist interview with therapist and it'll probably come up. And this guy with narcissistic personality disorder um, is like a social media content creator. And the basis of his social media is basically like describing to people what his experience as someone who's diagnosed with this disorder is like. And so you might start to see where this is going, which is like what is actually giving him social attention, potentially social approval, sympathy, right, is his discussion of his own personality disorder. And this therapist pointed out to him, very skillfully so, I'll admit, because it's a difficult thing to say to someone. He was like, "How like attached to this diagnosis are you? Like, how much are you actually gaining from continuing to see yourself this way?" I think there's a really fascinating way to look at that kind of thing. Of course, all sorts of other things remain true. Um, and that doesn't invalidate, the diagnosis or anything like that either. But I think this kind of thing is mirrored in a million different ways. People can, especially with pain related stuff, really, really create and attach themselves strongly to narratives about why this thing happened, about what happened to them. And in many cases, just in my experience helping people, a lot of the process is actually just unraveling the narrative first and showing people how to actually take the next step when they don't know what the problem is and they don't know what the solution is. Because that's where real development actually happens, is when you're in uncertainty and you can be like, I'm chill. It's chill. There's this uncertainty here, but like I'm going to take this next best guess. And that's what really good coaches do. They're like, hey, client, I don't know why your shoulder hurts right now. Let's try to change this angle. Let's try to, shallow the range of motion a little bit. Like good coaches are really, really good in that uncertain space.
Ooh, you're onto something there. And I think that if someone is rewarded for an identified, whether it's, valid or self-identified, physical pain, movement, whatever, mental health stuff, if they're rewarded because of a certain behavior around it, then that disincentivizes them to fix the problem.
Yeah, even pain. It's like you get sympathy from people, right?
Mm.
When you talk about this thing that you have, this thing that you, through no fault of your own, which is also true, in many cases, it's like, oh,
Mm.
this pain just happened, right? So yeah, that's a really interesting side of it. It's a much more difficult side of it to talk about publicly, and it's a much more difficult side to talk about with someone. And like I've started to do this more, like I'll just like go right into the most uncomfortable thing to say to a client. Which is kind of like it's my way of like filtering now for people who is like, oh, this is the kind of person that's going to respond well. Is like the person who, absorbs this really uncomfortable thing that I just said, and we grow closer because of it.
Are you familiar with Byron Katie and the Four Questions?
Of
right?
course. Yeah.
It's one of the four questions, like who would you be if you didn't have this thought,
Right. Right.
right? I love asking questions with clients. I love challenging narratives. I like asking people, what their narrative is. What was a story they told themselves, when they made a certain choice. I always couch it with like non-judgment, and that's something that works very well when you've already built trust with people.
Totally.
But it's powerful coaching techniques. We'll have to do a part two because we're out of time, but everybody can find your media and watch you hang out with your skeleton. Does your skeleton have a name? Is this
Frank.
Frank? Okay, cool. Uh, your Instagram is at Ben underscore Giannis, Yanes. No, does not rhyme with Michael Jordan's underwear. Sorry, guys, it's not Yanes, even though people say it. Ben underscore Giannis on Instagram. Is there anywhere else you want to point people to?
Yeah, modernmeathead.com is the website. So a lot of stuff you could find on there for me.
Ah, man, this is a treat. Thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate you.
Appreciate you, Andrew.